I've been asked to speak in English because there are people here who are not Maltese speaking, so it's not a political statement. I find this class quite weird, actually, because I have to swivel my head from left to right, and these especially have increased the angle of swivel. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about my book. I'm going to talk about the content of the book, and of course, the book itself is in a sense a summary. It doesn't go into as much detail as one would like to go into, and what it tries to do is, apart from the fact that it gives the narrative of what happened and how it happened and why it happened and why it unhappened at the end, but it's an attempt to find meaning in this is what we tell our students. You study history not in order to collect facts like a museum, but in order to understand even the world that we live in. And there's a lot to explain. There's a lot in what happened in those years that helps us understand the world that we live, especially in this country. Of course, we are very politicized. Politics is very much our bread and butter, more than in many other democracies. We take it very seriously, maybe even too seriously, and we live it because of our small size, but we live it not only in the good sense but also in the bad sense, that we expect politics to grant us favors sometimes, maybe things we don't deserve. Our connection with politics is a very personal one, and in a sense that culture, which preceded 1921, because it could go back to the time of the Knights of St. John, when charity, the state's charity, was an important part of our culture, and the idea that the government is there to bail you out or to help you get something which you might deserve or might not even deserve, was very much strengthened in the time of this constitution. On the other hand, on the positive side, is that democracy is about people power, about people engaging with government. Anyway, so I think the question of meaning has to be the underlying theme. Now, 1921 is a turning point. In some senses, it is a very important turning point. In another sense, you could say it's no turning point at all, because we were given a beautiful constitution, beautiful for the time, and we lost it. We lost it only 12 years later. The 1921 constitution was the best constitution we ever had until then, and the shortest. It wasn't the first constitution. Maltese politically minded leaders had been agitating for self-government ever since the British set foot in Malta, coming up with both historical and moral arguments. Historical, because they used to claim that once upon a time, since the redemption of the Maltese in the 15th century, time of Count Monroy and so on, I don't know if you remember your history, the Maltese had redeemed themselves and had a right to self-government, even as they continued to be part of the Kingdom of Sicily. Of course, the Knights of St. John did away with all that, and Maltese leaders at the onset of British rule pulled out from their historical memory this thing that once upon a time we were self-governing, which we weren't really. But anyway, once upon a time we were self-governing, and therefore we had a historical right, even under British protection. The other thing was the fact that the Maltese had invited the British to come here, and therefore they were not conquered. The idea that the Maltese were an unconquered people was very much at the forefront of political discourse. The British did not concede this right to self-government because, for a number of reasons. One, because they reckoned that if Malta was going to be of any use to them, it was going to be a strategic use. In other words, an instrument of military and naval policy. And in the words of the Duke of Wellington, you do not give a constitution to a battleship or to a man of war. And therefore, what was required here was strict security. They also did not really need. Why? Because they realized, the British realized from the start, that, why don't we settle down before I continue, because it's a bit distracting. The British realized from the start that the real power over the hearts and minds of the Maltese people was not these leaders, was not these politically minded intellectuals, but the church. And therefore, they took great care to work very much hand in hand with the church. The result, of course, was that very little changed socially and culturally during the 19th century. Anyway, eventually they did come around to give us constitutions. In 1949, the first constitution with an elected element, but a very tiny electorate, very tiny, very elitist electorate possessed of money and education. And in any case, the number of Maltese people who were elected were a minority in the Council of Government. So, so they could be overridden anytime. Then the next constitution was a better one, 1887, when this time the ratio was inverted. The Maltese representatives were in a majority in council. But what do these constitutions mean? It means that as long as Maltese representatives do not in any way oppose the policy of the British, then they could participate in government. But the moment they start being difficult, then the constitution could be withdrawn, as it was in fact in 1903. And then we were given back a constitution which was similar to the one before. So when we come to 1921, we already have a history and an apprenticeship in not quite self-government, but in power sharing, let us say. And the demand, the continuous agitation for self-government had never really ceased. Now, what happened in 1921 was the world changed, and I think this is a very important point to emphasize, that we must look at our national history in its international context. Remember, Malta was part of the British Empire, a very strategic part of the British Empire. In other words, a very political instrument within, the bigger picture of British imperial politics. The Mediterranean was a British lake. There were other powers who had interest in the Mediterranean, France in particular, Italy to a lesser extent, or to a larger extent after 1922. But Britain ruled the waves, literally, in the Mediterranean. And its headquarters and its chief operational base was the Maltese Islands. Malta, was Malta. So for Britain, Malta was a major, very important instrument in its policy of policing, patrolling, monitoring, intervening in the Mediterranean in general. So, in other words, and Britain in those days, of course, was a major world actor, world player. So you cannot divorce what's happening in Malta from what is happening in the world, because if Malta is a political stroke military instrument of Britain in one of the hottest spots in the Euro-Mediterranean area, then obviously their policy in Malta is going to be a function of that role in the much bigger world. Which is also why they were so reluctant for over 100 years to give the Maltese real power sharing. Incidentally, the other reason was that they reckoned that Malta was far too small physically to draw a line between internal affairs and things like security, foreign affairs, and so on. Because what the Maltese had always demanded was self-government in their internal affairs. They never demanded to be in charge of their own defense or their own currency or their own foreign policy. No, they wanted to be in charge of all those aspects of public life which are their own business. And the British argument used to be, you cannot really divide. You cannot really distinguish. It's too small. For example, if the military needed to build roads, these roads, once built, would be used by the Maltese also. So is that a question of imperial interest, or is it a question of local interest? The military had what was called clearing rights. In other words, if they needed to place a gun here to shoot in that direction, there couldn't be any buildings in between. And they had rights to carry out maneuvers even in your own personal property and so on. Anyway, this is an important point because what the Self-Government Constitution of 1921 does is it experiments with the possibility of dividing the two spheres. In fact, when we talk of self-government, we talk of a Maltese elected parliament, with its government, with its cabinet, which deals with purely internal affairs. Anything else was called reserved matters. Anything to do, even indirectly, with security, external affairs, even the harbors, for example, was the prerogative of the so-called Maltese imperial government. So what 1921 created was two governments, a Maltese one to deal with the purely internal affairs and the British one to deal with everything else. The line was not clear. It could be moved, but always in favor of the British side, never the other way. And of course, the British retained the right to suspend or even withdraw the Constitution if it should be deemed that it's not working as intended or in any way impeding the function of the services or British imperial interests. So this was the first time after 121 years that the British thought, okay, let's give it a try. Let's see if we can divide the spheres of Maltese, purely Maltese affairs from those of British imperial interests. So that was a major turning point. Now, there are two aspects of the 1921 Constitution. One is how it deals with the relationship between Malta and Britain, so our external relationship. And the other, how it deals with the question of democracy, the internal functioning of democracy. Now, what I keep telling my students, but they don't always understand for some reason, is that you have to make a distinction between constitutional development and democracy. Democracy, at its essence, is accountability of the government to those who put it there, to the electorate, to the people. It's simple. It's simple. To us, it is simple. Constitutional development has to do with the right of the Maltese, this word which means a lot and means nothing, of the Maltese to rule themselves. It's a nationalistic stance. It's nothing to do with being accountable to the common people. It's to do with saying, we are Maltese, you are British, we have a right to govern ourselves. not independence. Of course, that came much, much later. But we have a right to govern ourselves. And I'm saying this because for a long time, those people who agitated most for constitutional development, in other words, for more power to the Maltese, were not agitating for more power to the people. At no point did, for example, Maltese leading voices, there were some exceptions, George Mitrovic early on, but at no point did the most vociferous of Maltese people agitating for constitutional awards, did they propose universal suffrage? Did they propose to give the vote to anyone? Not. Now, of course, the world was much more behind in these things. But anyway, if you look at the how do you say, the gestation, the birth, the pre-birth, the pregnancy of the Maltese Constitution, you will see that even 1919, 1921, those 2 years, the most articulate and the most vociferous people in the National Assembly, which was trying to forge together a constitution according to the wishes of, again, that word, the Maltese, they were very reluctant to produce a democratic draft. The most vociferous people in the National Assembly, as you know, in February 1919, Filippo Ciberras had called together a National Assembly of bodies which represent a cross-section, supposedly, of the Maltese population. And the task was not just to agitate for self-government, but to actually present a draft constitution of what the Maltese wanted. And one of the most vociferous groups was the Chamber of Advocates. I'm sorry, are there any lawyers here? Extremely reactionary, totally reactionary. To the point that when other elements within the assembly proposed to expand the vote to include more and more people from the lower ranks of society, first they opposed it. They opposed it strongly. And when they couldn't continue opposing it, they said, okay, in that case, let's have an upper house, a Senate. And in the upper house, there'll be an elitist, very elitist franchise. And the role of the upper house is to keep in check the lower house, the Legislative Assembly. And they got away with it. And there was a lot of fighting. When you look at the minutes of the National Assembly, this is why when I say the Maltese, I put the inverted commas there, because we don't think, thankfully, we don't think with a single mind. But certainly there was a lot of tension, and the traditional forces, including the various representations of the church, the cathedral chapter, the Gozo Cathedral chapter, and whatnot, they were very much against the popularization of the Constitution. But anyway, the outcome was in a sort of Hegelian dialectic way. Ultimately, I'm using this, I'm dropping Hegel, of course, because you are philosophers. Ultimately, we got something which worked, which seemed to work, which was much, much better than before. Now, when we say the Maltese got together in this National Assembly to forge a constitution which they wanted to be governed by, I don't want to give the impression that it was all the decision of the Maltese. Their last word was that of Britain. The British had their own idea of what to accept, what to tolerate, and what absolutely would not be tolerated. And they did change a lot of what the Maltese National Assembly had proposed. But anyway, to keep, we're trying to keep in mind, I'm trying to keep in focus two things. One, that the Constitution altered, or at least pretended to alter, the relationship between Malta and Britain. So it's this nationalistic aspect of it. And the other thing is that the Constitution aimed to introduce a degree, or did introduce a degree of democracy, which was much higher than before, because the franchise was expanded to the point that those who did register to vote, because of course in those days you had to register to vote, and many people didn't even bother or didn't even know that they had to register to vote. But by 1932 is the last election we had. Practically every adult male, 21 over plus, every adult male who wanted to could vote. So we had almost universal male suffrage. Female suffrage would have to wait until the 1947 Constitution. It's interesting because nobody in the National Assembly stood up to say, are we going to leave the women in the lurch? There weren't any women to begin with. But nobody really didn't even occur to them. So in Britain, they had just introduced female suffrage. But anyway, it also goes to show how conservative even those who are agitating for a democratic constitution are. Anyway, okay, so there are those two aspects. Now, why 1921? Why not before? Again, this is where the international context really comes into play. First of all, there is a common perception, and I strongly oppose it, but you are free to accept it, that the 1921 Constitution was given to us as a result of the riots of 7 June of 1919, the 7 Giugno, riots in which 4 men were killed by British fire. The documents do not bear this out. In fact, one of the comments, the internal comments where the file changes hands from one civil servant at Whitehall to another, it is a pity, as it will now seem as if we gave in to a riot. In other words, the British had decided to give Malta a better constitution before the riots. And in fact, the National Assembly had met on February of 1919, a full 4 months before the riots. And the riots took place on the day that the Assembly was meeting for the second time, as it happened. And already the National Assembly had received from the Secretary of State notification that a better constitution will be coming. Have some patience. When the new governor arrives in Malta, his job will be to study the field and see what is possible and what is not possible. So in other words, so whether the constitution would have been the same one without the riots, I cannot tell. But the riots did not prompt the decision to give Malta a better constitution. In fact, when the governor arrived in Malta, Governor Plumer, who was, from the point of view of the Maltese people of those days, the best governor we ever had, he was a nice guy and so on, and he really loved the Maltese. His first reaction, when he was asked by his bosses back in London, what do you think? So what sort of constitution? He said, constitution, what constitution? These people need bread. Not politics, these people need bread. Let's spend our money. We need the loyalty of these people. Let's spend money. Let's subsidize bread. Let's create jobs, even if we have to pay for them. And he actually, without asking permission, he went and spent £250,000. So I'll tell you what £250,000 were. £250,000 subsidizing bread. Because in his opinion, this was a bread riot, what had happened here. And what the people needed was to fill their stomachs, not politics. And he said, well, no, we need Malta as a strategic base. We don't need constitutions here. What we need is a happy population. And the people are going to be happy if they have jobs and if they have bread. That's it. So certainly the first reaction was not to say, oh, let's give them a constitution. And he spent £250,000 of money, which he did not have. So in those days, the idea of deficit was sacrilegious, okay? The British Treasury was not going to let a colony spend more than it could raise. What was £250,000? £250,000 was about half the annual budget. So he overspent by 50%. The Treasury was up in arms back in Britain. They told Leo Amery. Now, Leo Amery is considered to be the drafter of the Constitution, ultimately. He was the Under Secretary of State for the colonies. Leo Amery was told, take a working holiday in Malta, all paid, go and see what this man is doing here, because he's going to get the Colonial Office in serious trouble with the Treasury. And when Leo Amery came to Malta in August, that's 2 months after the riots, and he put his head together with the new governor, with this Governor Plumer, well, to put it bluntly, he came to the conclusion that a constitution is cheaper than subsidies. The Treasury won't let them subsidize, but constitution is their business. It's the business of the Colonial Office. And in fact, he was quite frank about it, because when he announced that when Leo Amery now, this Under Secretary of State for the colonies, when Leo Amery announced in a dispatch that a constitution similar to what the Maltese wanted, now, when things go wrong, you cannot blame the British anymore, because now it's your. To be fair, he also persuaded the Treasury to give us a present of £250,000, so that the new government will start with a clean balance sheet. It wasn't usual for the British Treasury to give out money but anyway. So the Settegiunio was not the cause for Malta, was not responsible. Now, we like to think, some people like to think that the Settegiunio caused the award of the Constitution, because people need heroes. People need to think that what they achieved through their blood, through shedding blood. And I'm seeing Carm here. I'm sure that you heard it more than once in anniversaries of the Settegiunio or the 21 Constitution. The speaker of the day makes some speech, which somebody else has written for him, saying, we shed our blood for this. Okay, if that makes them happy. Anyway, so what brought about? First of all, we have to keep in mind that Malta was not the only place where there was a riot. There were two places in particular which had riots in which much more blood was shed than here. One was in Egypt, the Egyptian Revolution. Hundreds were killed. The Egyptians were effectively under British control because they wanted self-government or independence. And just weeks before Malta, the famous or infamous massacre, tal-Indija, Armitsar massacre, which was a wanton massacre. You had a peaceful demonstration in a public garden. The troops surrounded the garden, started firing their machine guns killing anything which came in front of them until they ran out of ammunition. They just wanted to give the Indians a lesson. The British did not, in the 7 Junio, go out to give the Maltese a lesson. They regretted it afterwards. It was stupidity on the part of, and incompetence on the part of the officers. Enough of that. What were the times? 1921. We have to keep in mind that in 1918, the First World War had come to an end. The Great War, as they used to call it, 1914 to 1918, which saw massacre of millions, and the final triumph of the Allies, represented mostly by the British, the French, the Americans, and the Italians, all of which were democracies. So, when you win a war, you think that you won the war because you were the good guy, and the ones who lost were the bad guys. And this was the spirit of the times. A brave new world will be created out of this bloodshed, out of this destruction, and the future of mankind for peace and for a durable peace, and to make sure that wars don't happen on the scale anymore, is self-determination and democracy. It was the democracies that had won. If this was especially the American President Woodrow Wilson's idea, if the world was made up of self-determining nations, in other words, independent peoples, people who are independent according to their ethnicity, language, whatever, to their nationhood, who are operating democratic government, then there won't be war, certainly not war on any scale. And the idea of the League of Nations, which is the forerunner of our United Nations, was created, that this would be a kind of club of nations which will make sure that the peace of the world is maintained, etc., etc. A lot of wishful thinking, but a certain degree of genuine idealism. Self-determination was applied wherever the people had been under enemy control. German, Austrian, Russian. Well, Russia, of course, had been an ally, but with the Bolshevik Revolution had turned on the other side. So you get all these new countries created: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, all these countries which were part of these defeated empires, and these were created anew. Some of them had existed before, like Poland, and some of them were created anew on the principle of self-determination, provided that they operate democratic government. So the idea of self-determination and democracy was very much the current fashion in terms of political discourse. If you look at the resolution passed by the Maltese National Assembly of February 1919, it quotes American President Woodrow Wilson and all this rhetoric of freedom and so on. And they are basically telling the British, okay, put your money where your mouth is. You talk nicely, you talk well, but now, here we are. We're not asking for independence, but we are asking for self-government. So self-government was a mild form of self-determination, but at the same time, a democratic democratic progression. So this was the spirit of the times. You cannot ignore it. You cannot ignore the fact that Malta was not alone in the world. And this is why the British Colonial Office was predisposed to give Malta a better constitution. Now, this constitution had a number of innovations, because it was the first time we had parliamentary government with our own cabinet of ministers and so on. One innovation is something which we still talk about today. But this was imposed by the British. It was not something that the Maltese Assembly wanted. Was the system of the single transferable vote, proportional representation by single transferable vote. This was what Leo Amery wanted at all costs. In Britain, there was the so-called Proportional Representation Society, which had tried to introduce in Britain itself, in British elections, the idea of proportional representation by single transferable vote. But they had failed. There had been a reform in 1911 in Britain. They had failed. Now, Leo Amery and the Secretary of State for the colonies, his boss, so to speak, Viscount Milner, were both members of this Proportional Representation Society. And they wanted to try it somewhere. So they thought, let's try it in Malta. And in fact, they tried it in two places, in Malta and in Ireland. Because Ireland also in 1921 obtained a new status, a sort of dominion status. But in these two places, the British government, let's say, imposed the system of proportional representation by single transferable vote. One reason was to please his friends in the society. The other reason was that Leo Amery believed that the way forward for Malta was that the divisions, the cleavage, the political cleavage should be between different Maltese political parties, you know, left, right, whatever, center, not between the Maltese and the British, as it used to be in previous constitutions. So he reckoned that with proportional representation by single transferable vote, you're going to get several parties elected in Parliament with no single party having a majority, you know, like you have in many countries, okay, in many democracies. And this would, of course, make for less polarization, more compromise, because if nobody has a majority, therefore they have to start horse trading, you know, to get allies to form a coalition. And the idea was that this would give Malta a multi-party system and a milder form of government. Of course, we defeated it, because by 1927, by the third election, we already were down to two parties. Three parties, actually. But on one side, there were the nationalists, who had started off with two parties, but in 1926 merged into one, into Il Partito Nazionale, as they used to call it. And the other was the compact between Strickland's Constitutional Party and the Labour Party. Although they retained their individuality, but they fought the election as one. So the election of 1927 was between the Partito Nazionale and the compact group, and the compact parties. You know, we know that in more recent history, each time we had a number of parties in Parliament, in 1947, in 1962. After a while, we come back to two parties. So, I don't know. Somehow the mechanics don't work here. But this is the big irony, that the idea of the single transferable vote, which we so often blame for our polarization between the two parties, our binary political system, this was meant specifically to avoid that. Anyway, so until now, 45 minutes later, I've only spoken about the construction and the donation of the Maltese Constitution. We started with a number of parties, two nationalist parties, one by Canon Panzavecchia, a moderate nationalist party, Unione Politica Maltese, another much more radical, much more intransigent, by Enrico Mizzi, the Partito Nazionale Democratico. Mostly the two leaders couldn't stand each other. Really. They couldn't stand each other, Panzavecchia and Enrico Mizzi. Enrico Mizzi, incidentally, although later on he became very conservative, but he was quite progressive. He, for example, formed an alliance with the Dockyard Union in the National Assembly, promoted white suffrage, and so on and so forth. Panzavecchia was more conservative. He was a priest politician. He thought that politics a political party existed in order to provide support for the church, basically, and its religion. Then there was the Labour Party, which was a new one, a completely new thing. It didn't even have a proper leader, in fact. And then there were two more parties, one by Gerald Strickland, the Anglo-Maltese Party, and one by Augusto Bartolo, the Constitutional Party, but then Strickland literally bullied Bartolo into giving up his party and joining together into the one Constitutional Party led by Strickland. The way he went about bullying him was that, see, Bartolo's Daily Malta Chronicle press had been burned down in the riots, and when the British said they were going to compensate those who lost property, he came up with claims which, according to Strickland, were totally exaggerated. So Strickland got invoices for the same machinery for much less, and accused him of corruption, basically. So that's the way he bullied him. Well, Strickland was a bit of a bully, although he gets a very bad press for some reason. And the reason why Strickland gets a very bad press is because when he died, his party finished with him, more or less. You know, there was Mabel, but that's... Anyway, it started off as a very promising experience. The Unione Politica Maltese of Panzavecchia won the largest number of seats. They managed to reach a deal with the Labour Party, with Partit al-Ħaddiema, as it was called, and somehow managed to last the first legislature. It was a 3-year legislature in those days. Second legislature, again the same, but then the Panzavecchia party reached out to the nationalists of Melik Mitzi and squeezed out the Labour Party, and then after that, the Labour Party started negotiating with Strickland. So we have two nationalist party or nationalist-led parties, 1921, 1924, and the third election, you have the election of the Strickland Labour Compact, which became a very stormy and unstable period, because between them, in different ways, because they did not have the same ideology, Strickland was a conservative, but between them, they proposed many changes, which rather shook the status quo. Now we remember that Strickland was a very outspoken anti-clerical. So in a sense, there was a certain inevitability in that he would eventually clash with the church, but also because he had progressive ideas. And certainly on the question of language, he wanted to eliminate Italian. Anybody who proposed Italian was a fascist for him, you know, and so on. Again, you have to keep in mind also what's also happening next door in Italy. From 1922, you have the Italian government falling into the hands of Mussolini, who is also proposing a Mediterranean empire, a new Roman empire, which implicitly challenged the British dominance of the Mediterranean. So Strickland could say, these are traitors. These are all traitors. These nationalists. Of course, the nationalists would pay him in kind, but. Anyway, what characterizes mostly the 3 years of the compact government is the clash with the church. The clash with the church, which also translated into a clash between the Legislative Assembly, in which, of course, which was the government, and the Senate. And the Senate included, amongst other members, 2 priests who represented the Archbishop, and these voted against Strickland. And each time he pushes a budget, you know, they sent it back, and you know, he couldn't govern, basically, until Leo Amery, who by this time had returned to be now Secretary of State for the Colonies, bailed him out by allowing the change of the Constitution to allow a simple majority in a meeting of both houses, lower and upper, to change the Constitution, which is what happened. I'm glossing over these things because there are very, very complex legal issues here. A lot of legislation was impugned. Anyway. But then ultimately, the crash came in 1930, when in May of 1930, elections were due. And the bishops of Malta and Gozo, Bishop Mauro Caruana and Bishop Michael Gonzi of Gozo, issued a joint pastoral letter saying that it was a mortal sin to vote for the compact parties. At that point, the governor said, no, we cannot have elections. These are going to be undemocratic elections. This is a corrupt practice. The bosses back in London, in Whitehall, were saying, hang on a second, there's nothing in the law which says that the church cannot interfere in elections. We don't have a corrupt practices law, as it's called, in Malta. So, let the elections proceed. But in the meantime, the struggle between Strickland and the church had been raised to the level of diplomatic relations between Britain and the Holy See. So for the British Foreign Office, this church interference in politics was seen as the interference of a foreign power, the Vatican, in the affairs of a British colony. And for the sake of British prestige, for no other reason, they agreed with the governor to suspend the constitution, to suspend the elections and suspend the constitution. And we were left for 2 years without a working constitution. It was restored eventually in 1932, after 2 years, after Strickland had submitted an abject apology. 2, actually. The first one wasn't accepted because he had written, if I have offended the church, I apologize. And the Vatican said, not if, when? And then he said anyway. After the church withdrew the mortal sin sanction on those who voted for the compact parties. Well, of course, by that time, the position of the compact parties as anti-clerical and anti-church and godless and God knows what not was established, and the Nationalist Party really swept the board in 1932 with a majority, almost, not quite, almost a two-thirds majority. Okay, now, this is where I would like to go back to the international context. Because, of course, within a year and a half, I believe the elections were held in May of 1932. On All Souls Day, 2nd November of 1933, the British suspended the Constitution. They fired the cabinet and suspended the Constitution. Why did they do that? Because they reckoned that the nationalist government was too pro-Italian, was too enamored with the Italians. The Italians themselves were spending a lot of money in Malta in propaganda. They opened the Italian Cultural Institute. They opened, they showered money on the Umberto Calosso School and other branches that they were opening. They were bringing in speakers from Italy to make public talks. They were sending children to free of charge to Rome on holidays, encouraging them to join the Balilla, these sort of fascist Boy Scout sort of thing. Anyway, the Italians themselves, independently of whatever the Maltese government was doing, were promoting a lot of propaganda in Malta. The Nationalist Party was pushing hard to reintroduce the teaching of Italian language in the primary schools, because when the Constitution was restored in 1932, it was restored with a new clause saying that Italian must not be taught in school except in secondary school, but nobody went to secondary school except those who wanted to become lawyers and doctors in those days. The nationalist government was trying to defeat these attempts by the British quite slyly, and they used to play cat and mouse games with the Secretary of State, who Cunliffe Lister, who wasn't a good person. Actually, he took them very personally. You know, he hated the way that they fooled him at every turn. So in the end, he said, "Okay, let's take away the Constitution." The Maltese government is not behaving in a way irresponsibly with this beautiful instrument that we gave them. They are using it against British interests. Now, another myth. The British took away the Constitution because they were afraid of Italian influence in Malta. That is not true. The British had no reason to fear the Italians. What the British were trying to do in these days was to court Mussolini. See, in 1932, Hitler's Nazi party in Germany makes major gains, and it's clear that he's heading for the top. Mussolini was a troublemaker, no doubt about it. But remember, in the First World War, Italy had been an ally of Britain. And throughout the 1920s, the British and the French, but especially the British, had tried to keep Mussolini on their side, even making concessions in Africa to him. Now, as long as Germany was down at heel, it's okay, you know, let him make trouble. At the end, he will always come back to us. But when Germany is changing, and when this Nazi party is saying, we don't care what you imposed on us in the peace treaty, in the Versailles Treaty at the end of the First World War, we do not accept anything. That was imposed on us, and we will change it. And Hitler meant it, and they knew that Hitler meant it. Now that the balance of power was between the Anglo-French sort of alliance on one hand and Hitlerite Germany on the other, Mussolini started promoting his policy of what he called peso dominante. In other words, the weight of Italy would make all the difference if it goes with the Anglo-French allies or if it goes with Germany. So he started becoming dangerous. His diplomacy started becoming dangerous. And the British were doing everything in their power to keep him on their side. The only thing that helped them was Austria. Hitler's number one on his program was the annexation of Austria into Germany, Anschluss. Austria stood between Italy and Germany on the Alps. That to Italy was the safest long-term guarantee against a future German aggression, you know, should regimes change and so on. And he would never tolerate an Anschluss. When he started seeing Hitler, on one hand, Hitler praising him because he's a fellow fascist like him, Hitler admired Mussolini very much ideologically. On the other hand, there was this thing, this Austria. When Mussolini sees Hitler coming to power, really in 1933, and saying Austria has to be, Austria is German, basically, it has to be annexed. Mussolini starts going to the British and telling them, no, let's stick together against him. And he's wavering. And then he asks for something, and they say, no, we cannot. Oh, okay. So he starts kissing Hitler, and so on and so forth. And for the British, in these years, the most important thing is to keep Mussolini with them and keep him away from Hitler. But each time they start talking about Austria or about some other, world meaningful issue, Mussolini says to the British, what sort of friends are you? You are eliminating the Italian language from Malta, the only place in your empire where Italian is spoken. And the British would say, well, but they say, yeah, that's not friendly. And each time they speak to him, this is the first thing he comes up with, trying to use, he understood that they wanted to keep him on their side. What did they do, the British? Instead of telling him, mind your own business, this is nothing to do with you, as they wanted to do, they withdraw the constitution. Because Malta was impeding Anglo-Italian relations. This is why. Not because the British were afraid of the Italians. Why would they be afraid of the Italians? The Italians would try to make a move in Malta only as part of a broad war. They're not going to go to war with Britain over Malta, as they did eventually in the Second World War. But this idea that the British were afraid of Italian influence here, they weren't afraid. It annoyed them. It annoyed them. But the reason why they took the constitution away was because they did not want Malta to keep popping up in this very difficult, very delicate relationship they had with Italy at a time, of course, when dark clouds were appearing on the horizon. We have to keep in mind that in 1929, not long time before, there had been the Wall Street crash, followed in subsequent years by the Great Depression. And the Great Depression erased all the goodwill that had been promoted very laboriously in the years after 1925, after the Locarno agreements. The spirit of the times. I started off with the spirit of the times. At the end of the First World War, we get our constitution. Everybody is talking of self-determination. Everybody is talking of democracy. Let's try it in Malta. Why not? 1933. All the democracies which had been created after the First World War had collapsed. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Yugoslavia, even others like Spain, Portugal. These were all practically either dictatorships or on the way to becoming dictatorship, like the Iberian Peninsula. So the spirit of the times wasn't favorable to democracy. No, of course, never mind the eradication of democracy in Germany. No, Austria was already very much no longer a democracy. That optimism of the years after the First World War, of a brave new world, of the war having been the war to end all wars, of a just and durable peace, of a community of nations in the League of Nations, ready to cooperate and police any states which falls out of line. All that was finished. We were back to where we were before the First World War, with an aggressive Germany making no secret of its intentions and saying basically, stop me if you can. So this is the international context in which the Constitution was taken, and of course it was taken because the British had the power to do so. And I think I'll leave you there. I welcome questions because, of course, I only skimmed over the period. There's so much else to say. But please, any questions that you want to put? Okay. Was it a loss? Well, it's always a loss. I mean, if you have something which is putting you on the way to being a...
dominated by one party.
Well, we don't know that it would have continued to be so, No, it was definitely a loss. But then on the positive side, it got the Maltese, and now I say the Maltese without inverted commas, because you have more and more people who are involved in the political process, accustomed to being a democracy. In other words, it instilled the culture that this is the only form of government that suits us. So then after the Second World War, when we were given a constitution which was similar to it, better but similar, there was no question of what sort of regime we should have. And of course, the British then had also at the time took it away, the constitution, in 1958, and they restored it 2 years before independence. But see, the whole, if you take it as part of the longer constitutional history of Malta, which starts in 1849, roughly, and then, gets a bit better, it gets better, then gets worse, then gets better, gets worse. You see a century and a half a century and a quarter of acclimatization. And as a result of that, once we became independent, there was no question of whether we should go the way of so many other countries which became independent. Remember that at the end of the Second World War, the old European empires, especially the British and the French, which were the largest, dissolved, and in many cases, not in all cases, in many cases, the various nations had to fight for their independence and shed their blood for their independence. And almost in all cases, the liberation movement assumes power and legitimacy on the grounds that it was the liberation movement, not on the grounds that the people have elected it. So if you look close to us, you look at Egypt, you look at Libya, Tunisia also għandhom xi ħaġa, Algeria, Morocco. These all obtained their independence in those years. But we remember in 2010-11 how much turmoil there was there, and where are they today? They're still back. So democracy is something which you have to be a culture to, I believe. It's not some. It sounds simple, but it's something that we are. So I think that this was our first real experience. Yes, it's part of a chain, but it's our first real experience as a parliamentary democracy, and we got accustomed to it. Yeah.
Just meant for the Dominion status.
Thanks for asking that, because I wanted to speak about it, but there was no time. Dominion status means to be almost independent, like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand, in those days also South Africa, where the country has full autonomy, but is committed to cooperate with Britain, with the empire, in issues of foreign relations, especially security relations. So you see the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Canadians in the Anzac troops in the First World War, for example. But other than that, they are completely free. Now, the Maltese politicians in those days really wanted Dominion status. That is what they gave. Sahi, mhux Nationalist Party. In 1932, as soon as they were elected, in 1932, the Nationalist Party, as soon as they were elected, sent a delegation to Britain to ask for a return of the teaching of Italian and Dominion status. There was your grandfather, of course. Dak kienu Ugo Mifsud, Derek Mitzi or Carmelo. Oh, okay, all right. Yes, now, they asked for it formally. However, Strickland had asked for it very, very insistently when he was Prime Minister after 1927. He even got an expert, a certain Berridale Keith, which eventually the nationalist government employed, a constitutional expert. In both cases, they cited Southern Rhodesia, today's Zimbabwe, as semi-dominion, because they were looking for quasi-dominion status. The reason for quasi was because Malta could never be fully considered as a dominion, because there were too much imperial interests intimately involved. But you can go even before that, because if you look at the National Assembly, at the minutes of the National Assembly, you would see that the tone debate was that we were moving towards dominion status. And when they were drafting the kind of constitution they wanted, they borrowed a lot from the constitution of Australian and other dominion. When Amery established that there's going to be reserved matters and a separate Maltese imperial government to deal with imperial interests, the voices in the assembly said, why aren't you trusting us? Why don't you leave everything in our hands and then we consult each other, like partners? So they were very much behaving like they were moving towards dominion status. And dominion status was a formula that kept Malta within the British Empire, enjoying the advantages in economic terms. Remember, Britain was the biggest employer here. The British services were the biggest employers, which is why the Maltese never really wanted independence. So dominion status was a formula whereby we get full freedoms, full national freedom, but continue to serve the role that we serve. Alec quasi-dominion status. And in fact, the Nationalist Party then in the 1950s had promoted that at the same time that the Labour Party was promoting integration. But yes, and there is some interesting. You know, when you have a file, is anybody a civil servant here? Has anybody been a civil servant? You get a file, right, and it lands on the desk of an officer. For example, there's a dispatch there, and the officer scribbles something, saying, this had better be seen by the legal officer, and then it goes to the legal officer, and then it goes to until it reaches the Secretary of State, the top boss, the top dog, and then the dispatch is composed in reply. Now, so the most interesting parts of these British documents is not the actual dispatches, the exchange of but the process in which ultimately the decision has been taken, and these notes, these minutes, as they call them. And when the Constitution was awarded and the Prince of Wales was he actually came here to open our Parliament, the Crown Advocate was tasked with writing his opening speech, the speech from the throne. And he referred to Malta as a self-governing state. And the guys at the Colonial Office, of course, who vetted what the Prince of Wales was going to read, crossed it out and said, this is not a self-governing state. Only the dominions are self-governing. Self-governing was a technical word to refer to the dominions. And then somebody else said in response, but the dominions will be very insulted if we allowed this term, self-governing state. Amery himself said, no, only in Parliament, only the dominions are self-governing. And then someone else said, so what are we going to call them? What are we going to say? And then they did not use the word self-governing nation. They used Malta. They just left Malta. But the idea of dominion status was there from the start. In the National Assembly, and yes, and the Nationalist Party had proposed it in they didn't even get a reply in 1932, because then politics got mixed up into the question of languages. Anyway, so that. Yeah, but in retrospect, the British would never have given us dominion status. It was too. They would have given up too many, too many powers. And we have to keep in mind, this was a strategic base. This was for them a fortress. And in fortresses, you have to be very careful with too much with too much democracy. Yes, yes, yes.
So going far ahead in time, when we gained independence, but we still have the Queen as our head of state, what was the difference with the Dominion state?
Well, first of all, the Queen was the Queen of Malta. Remember, she was Queen Elizabeth of Malta. She wasn't Queen Elizabeth II of Malta. She was, in a sense, Queen Elizabeth I of Malta. So when we became independent, we asked the Queen to be our head of state, so to speak. It's a subtle.
With independence, we have every right to decide on our foreign
Yes. The Queen became a figurehead pretty much in the way that she was in the UK. Even the Governor General who represented her had no powers whatsoever. He was a bit like our president today. But yes, the fact that the Queen was British and the Governor General who represented her was British, it was a bit so. But insomma spiċċina ħjomint of dawk in 1971. Yes, but I think it's more of a symbolism. They say that Borch Olivier admired the Queen and that he wanted her to be, I don't know. Inti tkun tafittet minni. Anyway, any other questions? This is getting interesting. Portugal, well, jista' jkun ukoll. Infatti, there's a story that, when they gave us, when we got the new flag, we put the George Cross there in the corner, and there was a question of the color of the ribbon. We have a red ribbon around and apparently originally the idea was to be a blue ribbon, and Borcheville said, no, it's too royal. A blue ribbon would be too much. Yeah. Anyway, that's all. Okay, thank you very much.